The persistent drizzle outside grew into a downpour, a rhythmic drumming against the window pane. At the front of the apartment, the lock clicked. The sound was a starting pistol, signaling the arrival of the story's first critical juncture. I knew my husband, Julian, was home, and the man the universe had chosen for him, Ethan Vance, was with him. In this world, I was just a placeholder, a catalyst for their story. A disembodied voice had made that clear when I woke up in this body after my own untimely death. It promised me a second chance at my old life if I just played my part, the part of the washed-up, bitter husband. So after my tech startup imploded, I embraced the role, letting the failure consume me. I spent my days lost in the glow of a television screen, controller in hand, while Julian worked to support us both. The resulting shame twisted itself into cruelty, and I found fault in everything he did, my bitterness a shield against my own inadequacy. I was a beta, incapable of truly satisfying the needs of an omega like him during his cycles, a biological fact that reality had sharpened into a weapon between us. Ethan, the story's true hero, was meant to be his salvation. It was my turn to perform. I tossed the controller onto the worn leather couch and shuffled out of the den, my bare feet sinking into the plush, cream-colored carpet Julian had insisted on installing throughout the apartment. He met me in the entryway, his expression a mixture of surprise and a faint, hopeful glimmer. Behind him stood Ethan, his presence immediately commanding the space. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his posture radiating a quiet authority, his gaze sharp and intelligent. A classic leading man. Julian's lovely features, usually serene, flickered with an unaccustomed nervousness before settling into a soft delight. He asked if I had come out to greet him. I tilted my chin up, my voice laced with a practiced disdain, and told him not to flatter himself. My eyes drifted to the man behind him, and I inquired who he was. As I sized up Ethan, he returned the scrutiny, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. I was wearing black silk pajamas patterned with small, stylized cats, the fabric clinging to a frame that was long and lean. My skin was pale from months spent indoors, a stark contrast to the dark material. A carefully cultivated air of arrogant contempt settled on my features, though a small mole near the corner of my eye seemed to subvert the effect, an unintentional mark of allure. The sight of my bare feet on the carpet seemed to draw Julian's attention. His expression softened completely. He knelt, his hand gently touching the top of my foot, remarking that I was cold and should wear socks around the house. He then introduced his companion as Ethan Vance, a new executive at his firm. He explained that the storm had been relentless, and Ethan's car had run out of gas after he'd offered Julian a ride. He had invited him to stay the night. I scoffed at the flimsy excuse about the car, certain it was a pretext to get closer to Julian. I pressed my foot down on the back of Julian's hand where it rested on my own, the gesture both dismissive and possessive. I told him to stop fussing over me. He lowered his eyes, his submission absolute, his fingers curling slightly against my skin before I pulled away. I shot a glare at Ethan. I declared that their guest could have Julian's room, but he was not to sleep on my sofa. Then I announced I was hungry. I was doing them a favor, practically pushing them into the same bed. Before Julian could respond, Ethan's voice, smooth and measured, cut in. He inquired if we slept in separate rooms. The question made Julian's face tighten with discomfort. I leaned into my role, letting out a cold sneer. I stated that I had no desire to sleep with him, and that anyone who wanted to was welcome to it. I added for good measure that we had never done anything, a pointed declaration for Ethan's benefit. His eyebrows rose slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of this unexpected information. Julian's face had gone ashen, but he quickly masked it with a determined smile, telling me he had brought dinner home, my favorite braised short ribs. I settled onto the couch with a sense of regal entitlement as Julian arranged the containers on the coffee table. The rich aroma of the ribs and creamy polenta filled the air. While I prepared to eat, He retrieved a pair of white cotton socks from his bedroom and knelt before me again, carefully sliding them onto my feet. I ignored him, focusing on the food. Resisting his gestures of care was pointless. It would only make him look at me with those wounded, tear-filled eyes, a sight I found increasingly difficult to bear. From the moment I had appeared, his attention had been entirely on me, a constant, orbiting presence. Once the socks were on, he remained by my side, watching me eat. His gaze so full of adoration and tenderness it felt tangible. Ethan's deep voice broke the quiet. He observed what a good relationship we seemed to have and then asked what I did for a living. He had undoubtedly already investigated Julian's life, knew about my failed company and my current state of unemployment. The question was a deliberate jab, meant to highlight my pathetic reliance on Julian. I played my part, letting manufactured indignation cover my very real insecurity. I retorted that I couldn't be bothered with a dead-end 9-to-5 job, boasting that companies were lining up to hire me. Julian's eyes curved into crescents as he smiled, his expression one of pure, unadulterated admiration. He agreed that I was the most brilliant person he knew. Even as a complete washout, he looked at me as if I were a king, his most devout follower. Ethan's piercing eyes remained fixed on me, a thoughtful glint within them. He conceded that if a man like me were to enter the workforce, I could probably earn more in a month than most people do in a lifetime. I was surprised by the compliment but took it in stride, retorting that it was obvious. Julian, however, frowned slightly at Ethan's tone, and he suggested that Mr. Vance must be tired and should get some rest. He pointed him toward the guest room, mentioning fresh towels and a toothbrush in the bathroom cabinet. Ethan accepted with a polite, faintly mocking smile and headed for the bathroom. The atmosphere felt charged. I sensed Ethan's jealousy and figured Julian needed to smooth things over. I turned to my husband, my tone purposefully harsh, and told him to stop hovering over me because he was annoying. I told him to go away. Julian's expression dimmed, a shadow of pain crossing his features as he bit his lip. He murmured that he understood. Seeing that look, I felt a pang of guilt and quickly added a justification. I reminded him that he had a guest and should be a proper host, lest people think we had no manners. Julian froze for a second. Then a shy, pleased smile bloomed on his face as if I had given him a precious gift. He said he understood and, following my implicit instruction, walked toward the bathroom. I heard him knock gently and ask if Ethan had found everything he needed. A muffled reply came from within, and then the door opened and Julian slipped inside. The bathroom door was frosted glass, blurring their forms into two indistinct shadows that stood close together. Their voices were too low to make out. I imagined Ethan confessing his feelings, questioning how a useless husband like me could possibly satisfy him, offering to help him through his heat cycles. I pictured Julian's flustered, angry refusal. My train of thought was shattered by a loud thud from the bathroom, followed by a muffled grunt. It sounded intense. My chopsticks clattered against the plate. I quickly lowered my head and shoveled food into my mouth, then retreated to my den, determined to be the oblivious husband, deaf and blind to the unfolding drama. My room was a shrine to my indolence, crammed with video game cases and collectible figurines. If I ever mentioned wanting something, Julian would find a way to get it for me, including rare, limited-ion items that must have cost a fortune. I assumed they were high-quality fakes. I played for a while, but fatigue soon settled in, and I climbed into bed. Sleep brought dreams of my first meeting with Julian. Back then, I wasn't bound by a script, wasn't forced to be cruel. I was genuinely stunned by him. He was slender and graceful, with skin like porcelain and a smile that felt like the first warm day after a long winter. He had greeted me shyly, and my brain, still adjusting to this world's social cues, had blurted out an awkward compliment about his eyes. In the context of alphas, betas, and omegas, it was a clumsy, forward remark, especially to an omega. A faint pink blush had crept up his neck, but he had been kind enough to overlook my gaffe. My worldview was fundamentally different from this place. I believed love shouldn't be dictated by pheromones. That was no better than an animal acting on instinct. Love was a meeting of souls. Whenever I spoke of these things, Julian would listen, his gaze fixed on my face, his eyes full of a profound, starry depth. Our connection was built on conversation and shared dreams, not sense. An orphan, he yearned for a family, a home. His vulnerability was the opening the scoundrel, had exploited. I remembered our wedding day. He wore a white suit, his face radiant. He looked at me, his clear eyes brimming with love and hope, and told me that his soul loved my soul. He wanted to spend his life with me and would give anything for it. I froze, a tremor of panic seizing me. How could I, a fraud, accept such pure, unwavering devotion? But the voice in my head returned, whispering that my purpose was only to bring Julian and Ethan together, that their happiness was preordained. It asked if I could bear the consequences of altering his fate. Couldn't. I woke with a start, the pillow beneath my head damp. I sat up, rubbing the grit from my eyes, and heard a soft knock at my door. The clock read 10:30 p.m. I had only been asleep for an hour. The door creaked open, and Julian stood there, clutching his pillow. He was wearing a white pajama set that matched my own. He bit his lip, his gaze a silent plea. He asked, his voice small and hesitant, if he could sleep on the floor in my room. My resolve nearly crumbled. I turned my face away, snapping that he couldn't and should go back to his own room. Fat, crystalline tears immediately welled in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks, his long lashes trembling. The sight of his silent, heartbreaking sorrow was my undoing. My defenses shattered. I threw myself back on the bed, pulling the covers over my head. Fine, I grumbled, my voice muffled by the duvet. Sleep wherever you want. A nagging thought surfaced. It felt as if he knew exactly how to dismantle my resolve, as if he knew his tears were my greatest weakness. He settled on the rug beside my bed and wished me a soft goodnight. I didn't need to see him to know the look of utter devotion he was giving me. The short nap had left me wide awake. I lay in the dark for what felt like an eternity before drowsiness began to reclaim me. Just then, I heard a rustling sound from the floor, accompanied by a faint, breathy sigh. He seemed to be sitting up. My blanket shifted, and a hand slid beneath the covers. I shot upright, my heart hammering, and turned to look at him. His face was flushed an unnatural red. His eyes glazed over with a raw, undisguised longing. A pained, suppressed gasp escaped his lips. The air grew thick with the scent of honeysuckle and warm vanilla. He whispered my name, telling me he was in terrible pain and begging me to help him. He grabbed my wrist. I knew immediately what was happening. It was his heat cycle. This was why the original story had him and Ethan cross the line tonight. For years, Julian had relied on suppressants, and without a partner's help, his cycles were short but unpredictable. He never knew when one would strike, so he always carried medication. I frantically started searching him, asking where his suppressants were. He trembled at my touch, guiding my hand lower, his skin fever-hot. The contact sent a jolt through him, and his lashes fluttered, his eyes swimming with a mixture of love and pure temptation. He begged me not to use the suppressants, to just give him what he needed. I froze, then yanked my hand back as if burned. I told him I would get them for him and scrambled out of bed. He caught me from behind, wrapping his arms around me, his hot tears soaking into the collar of my pajamas. He sobbed, his voice breaking as he pleaded with me to give him a baby, to just look at him, to love him. His desperation was a physical weight. His desire to use a child to mend our fractured marriage laid bare. The heat of his tears scalded my neck. I gritted my teeth and pushed him away. I forced the cruelest words out, telling him it was over, that I didn't love him anymore, that nothing he could do would change that. My own fists were clenched so tight my knuckles were white. The thought of getting a vasectomy the next day flashed through my mind, a desperate measure to keep the story on track, to ensure his eventual happiness. Julian's eyes went vacant, the tears stopping as if frozen. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking shattered and fragile. He reached a hand out as if to touch me, but let it fall back to his side. I found the emergency suppressants in a hall closet and returned to administer the injection. He sat on the bed, staring at me with hollow, deep-set eyes, perfectly still as the needle went in. As I turned to leave, he caught the hem of my shirt. I stopped. He asked where I was going. He managed a small, fragile smile, the same smile he always gave me, as if nothing had happened. The disconnect was jarring. It was as though no matter what I did to him, he would absorb the pain and continue to love me unconditionally. I pulled my shirt from his grasp. I couldn't sleep in a room so saturated with his scent. I told him, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. A beta like me couldn't truly smell pheromones, but I used it as an excuse to leave him the bed, knowing the living room couch would be cold. As I was about to settle onto the sofa, I saw Ethan emerge from the guest room. He was calmly getting a glass of water from the kitchen. I tried to ignore him, but he spoke first. He said that if I needed a job, he could offer me a well-paying one. I looked at him, surprised by the complete derailment of the night's script. Julian hadn't ended up with him, and now the man was acting like a recruiter. His gaze was sharp and shrewd as he offered me a position as his executive assistant, with a six-figure salary. I saw the trap in his eyes. He despised me and wanted me under his thumb where he could torment me. I sneered and refused. Unperturbed, he slid a business card across the coffee table, telling me to think about it. It had only a name and a number. I picked it up, and with a deliberately malicious grin, dropped it into the trash can in front of him. I told him there was a long line of people who wanted me, and he wasn't even close to the front. He merely raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He said he would work his way up the line, then wished me good night and returned to his room. I muttered under my breath about him being a lunatic and pulled a blanket over my head. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed. The sheets were fresh, and the faint smell of an air freshener hung in the room. A glass of lukewarm water was on the nightstand, and breakfast was laid out on the desk. He had listened to everything. A wave of sadness washed over me, but I pushed it away, reminding myself that soon, Julian would be free of me. We would both get our new beginnings. I ordered takeout for lunch and was about to dive back into my games when I noticed the construction noises from the apartment next door had stopped. It wasn't hard to guess who the new tenant was. Ethan was a man who understood the value of proximity. Later that afternoon, Julian called, his voice warm and cheerful, asking what I wanted for dinner. He wasn't working late. I rattled off a list of complicated dishes I'd never had before: seafood paella, beef Wellington, lobster bisque. He didn't question it, simply assuming I'd seen them online and was curious. He promised to do his best. He came home later than usual, presumably delayed by the grocery shopping. Before he arrived, however, Ethan did. I opened the door to find him dressed in a soft gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans, the casual attire making him seem more approachable. He held up a beautifully wrapped box, a charming smile on his lips. He announced himself as our new neighbor, offering a housewarming gift as thanks for our hospitality. I saw the logo for an expensive artisanal chocolatier on the box, and my disdain melted away. I graciously accepted the gift and invited him in. The man was thorough, I had to give him that. He'd even researched my sweet tooth. We were sitting on the couch, making stilted small talk, when Julian finally arrived, his arms full of grocery bags. His smile froze for a fraction of a second when he saw Ethan, but he recovered quickly. Ethan explained his move, and I, feeling generous because of the chocolates, invited him to stay for dinner. Julian, as always, deferred to my wishes. He told us to wait while he got started in the kitchen. As I watched him disappear, I glanced at Ethan, who was still sitting placidly on the couch. The man had no initiative. This was a golden opportunity for some one-on-one time in the kitchen, and he was wasting it. I nudged him with my foot. I told him to go in there and make himself useful, maybe chop some vegetables. He seemed surprised. Then a pleased look crossed his face as he asked if I wanted to taste his cooking. Since his arrival, he had dropped the formal Mr. Thorne and started calling me by my first name, Caleb. I confirmed that was exactly what I meant. He got up and went to the kitchen without another word. Perfect. I had created another chance for them to bond. I turned the television volume up, drowning out any sound from the other room. The meal they prepared was incredible. Julian's cooking was, as always, exquisite. He seemed to believe the old adage about the way to a man's heart being through his stomach. I offered a simple compliment, telling him it was good. His cheeks flushed with pleasure, and he looked at me as if I'd just handed him the moon. Ethan then pointed out that several of the dishes were his own personal favorites, and he thanked Julian for being so thoughtful. Julian started to correct him, to say that I had been the one to request them, but I cut him off, telling them both to just eat. I needed Ethan to believe Julian had made them for him. Julian's lips pressed into a thin line, the knuckles of the hand holding his fork turning white. His mind, sensitive and prone to overthinking, likely connected the dots. My inviting Ethan, my requesting his favorite dishes, my sending him into the kitchen. He must have thought I was trying to set them up because I had developed feelings for Ethan. The absurdity of it was lost on me as I savored the delicious food. Ethan's dishes were placed at the far end of the table. Every time I reached for one, Julian would intercept, placing something else on my plate, asking me to try this or peeling a shrimp for me. By the end of the meal, I was stuffed, having not tasted a single bite of what Ethan had made. After dinner, Julian announced with a sweet smile that he'd cut his hand earlier and couldn't get it wet, looking directly at Ethan. Ethan, taking the hint, offered to wash the dishes. While he was occupied, Julian sat beside me, peeling oranges and cutting apples, placing the pieces directly into my mouth. When Ethan returned, he was met with the sight of me lounging like a pasha, being hand-fed fruit by my doting husband. Julian glanced at Ethan, a flicker of triumph, of possessiveness, in his eyes. Later, I suggested a movie. We sat with Julian in the middle, a respectable distance between him and Ethan. I had chosen a particularly steamy romance film to set the mood. As the lights dimmed, I realized the gap between them was too wide. I leaned heavily against Julian, nudging him closer to Ethan. He tensed, flustered by my sudden proximity, and stammered my name. I slid down, resting my head in his lap. As my ear brushed against his thigh, I felt the muscle beneath clench. A low sound rumbled in his throat. I feigned annoyance to cover my own embarrassment, telling him to shift over so I could lie down properly. He complied, moving with painstaking care, then sat perfectly still, letting me use him as a pillow. I knew the movie's plot by heart. Just before the most intimate scene, I stood up, announcing a trip to the bathroom. It was the perfect excuse to leave them alone in the dark, romantic atmosphere. As I left, I caught Ethan's eye and gave him a subtle nod, a clear signal to make his move. I didn't see the hurt and jealousy that flashed in Julian's eyes. I settled in the bathroom, planning to kill half an hour on my phone. But 10 minutes later, the door opened. It was Julian. He looked at me with a wounded, accusatory expression, as if he knew I wasn't really using the restroom. He asked me who I had been hoping would come in. Ethan? The question made no sense. He knelt before me, his hands resting on my stomach, his eyes full of a desperate, pleading love. He told me he would do anything for me, that I shouldn't want anyone else. Before I could process his words, his face was close to mine, his soft lips capturing my own. A muffled groan escaped my throat. My body went rigid, a current of electricity shooting through me. My hands braced against the cool tile of the wall as he looked up at me, his gaze hot and wet. I tried to push him away, but his grip was firm, his touch both a caress and a. His breath was hot against my skin, his voice a low, seductive murmur. He told me that I could never control a man like Ethan, but that he, Julian, was mine completely. He loved every part of me, even the broken parts, and would give me his entire being. I was stunned into silence. He leaned against my legs, a shy, gentle smile on his face, looking at me with pure adoration. The scene felt like a surreal, erotic dream. When he was finished, my mind was a complete blank. He looked up at me, his expression earnest, and asked if he had done a good job. After that night, I understood. I had been a fool. My attempts to push him toward Ethan had been horrifically misinterpreted. He thought I wanted Ethan and was offering himself up in the most desperate way possible to win me back. I had to fix my mistake. Julian's birthday was approaching. I told him I wanted to take him out for a special dinner and that I would handle the reservation. He was ecstatic, thanking me over and over. I didn't understand what he was so grateful for. He simply nodded, then shyly shook his head, explaining that he was thanking me for spending his birthday with him. I scoffed, telling him not to get so worked up over something so small. He looked at me, the tenderness in his eyes so profound it felt like a physical blow. He said that with me, nothing was a small thing. I was momentarily speechless, a dull ache spreading through my chest. On the evening of his birthday, I executed my plan. I had reserved a table at a romantic restaurant with candlelight and roses. I told Julian to meet me there after work. I also told Ethan that we were throwing a surprise party for Julian and that he should be there too. Then, I hid in a shadowy corner across the street and watched. They both arrived and stood there, stunned to see each other and no one else. I saw Julian pull out his phone to call me, but I had already turned mine off. A waiter approached, asking if they were ready to order. Julian replied that they were still waiting for someone. The waiter, confused, informed him the reservation was for two. The look of dawning, soul-crushing realization on Julian's face was something I would never forget. He understood. All my recent actions, all my supposed kindness, it was all a ruse to push him away, to hand him over to someone else. A bitter, knowing smile touched his lips. He told the waiter there were no other guests. As they sat down to a silent, awkward meal, I felt a weight settle on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I clutched at my shirt, telling myself this was right. This was his happy ending. I went home but couldn't sleep. Hours later, I heard the front door open. Julian was back. His footsteps were heavy as he walked down the hall and stopped right outside my bedroom door. I squeezed my eyes shut, feigning sleep, my heart pounding in anticipation of the confrontation. But it never came. He just stood there in complete silence for what must have been 10 minutes. Then, the footsteps retreated. The silence he left behind was heavier than any accusation. I couldn't imagine what thoughts had gone through his head in those long, agonizing minutes. I pulled the covers over my head. He was finally giving up on me. It was for the best. The next day, the glass of water and breakfast were there as always. He was a creature of profound kindness. He even asked what I wanted for dinner before he left for work. His voice as gentle as ever, as if the previous night had never happened. The more normal he acted, the more the guilt gnawed at me. I would have preferred him to scream at me, to hit me, anything but this quiet, heartbreaking tolerance. When he came home that night, he paused before going to the kitchen. My body tensed, bracing for the inevitable. But he only smiled and asked if he should invite Ethan over to share the meal he had bought ingredients for. I nodded numbly. To my surprise, he seemed pleased. Things shifted after that. Julian began inviting Ethan over regularly. He started buying food he knew Ethan liked. They were getting closer. It was all going according to plan. Soon I could leave, get my life back. And Julian would be happy. A win-win. I stopped saying cruel things to him. I found myself just watching him sometimes, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way he smiled. I was going to miss him. He seemed to notice the change, the absence of my usual anger. I had a lawyer draw up divorce papers. I took nothing. I signed my half and hid them at the bottom of my closet, ready for when the time came. But the call I received wasn't from Julian asking for a divorce. It was from his office, telling me he had collapsed. A cold dread seized me. I rushed to the hospital, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I found him in a bed, his face pale against the white pillows, looking small and fragile. Ethan was there. I grabbed his arm, my voice frantic, asking what had happened. He tried to reassure me, saying it was likely just exhaustion. But I knew it was more than that. A doctor entered and asked if I was family. I nodded fiercely, telling him I was his husband. The look the doctor gave me was one of pure contempt. He informed me that as a beta, I should have been more aware. Julian was suffering from extreme psychological distress. He had been on suppressants for years, and worse, he had been undergoing regular, painful alpha pheromone resistance treatments at a private clinic. The doctor's words were like punches to the gut. An omega choosing a beta meant he must have loved me immensely. He said that even if I couldn't mark him, the least I could do was care for his mental well-being and stop tormenting him. I turned to Ethan, my voice a strangled whisper. I asked him why he hadn't marked him. Ethan looked at me with a weary, frustrated expression. He explained that nothing had ever happened between them. Julian had only been trying to get close to him because he thought it was what I wanted. He was just trying to make me happy. It was only then that I understood. I had been so convinced by the story, by the roles we were supposed to play, that I had been blind to the truth. Staring at Julian's still form, my heart fractured. Memories flooded my mind. His gentle smile, his loving gaze, the heartfelt vows on our wedding day. He wasn't a character in a book. He was Julian, my husband, a living, breathing person who loved me. And I, somewhere along the way, had fallen in love with him too. Tears streamed down my face, hot and unstoppable, dripping onto his cold hand. I whispered my apologies over and over. The voice returned, a final, tempting offer. It reminded me that if I stayed, I would lose my chance at rebirth. It asked if it was worth giving up my old life for love in this strange world. But my old world didn't have him. I had made my decision. I would bear any consequence. When Julian woke up, he was surprised to see me. I just smiled and asked him where else I would be. I fed him the soup I had bought, blowing on each spoonful to cool it. He watched me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and wonder, as if he were in a dream he was afraid to wake from. I stayed by his side for 2 days. When the doctor cleared him for discharge, I was relieved. But Julian seemed hesitant. He asked, his voice small, if he could stay a few more days. I knew why. He thought my kindness was conditional on his illness. The thought made my heart ache. I told him we needed to go home, that I had something important to tell him. Back at our apartment, I led him to my room. I told him that from now on, we would sleep in here together. His eyes widened, a wave of stunned, unadulterated joy washing over his face. He asked if I was serious. I nodded and told him to rest while I moved his things from his room. Action was better than words. His room was sparse and neat, decorated in cool grays, a stark contrast to his warm personality. I gathered his clothes and carried them back to my room. When I entered, I found him standing by my closet, the door open. In his hand was a white document, the divorce papers. My blood ran cold. He turned to look at me, his expression utterly blank, devoid of any emotion. The calm was more terrifying than any rage. He asked if I was divorcing him. I rushed to explain that those were from before, that I had changed my mind. He cut me off, his voice flat. He asked if I was going to lie to him again. He would not believe me. I was speechless. He walked past me, retrieved a small, unlabeled bottle of pills from a drawer in the living room, and calmly swallowed one. My instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. I asked him what he was taking. He paused, then unscrewed the cap and took another. The effect was almost immediate. A flush spread across his face, just like when his heat began. But he made no sound, simply waiting. I understood. I lunged for the bottle, yelling at him to spit them out. He leaned against me, his body already radiating heat, and a gentle smile touched his lips. He rested his head on my shoulder and whispered that he was just worried I wouldn't be able to sign the papers if he was unwell. He said that we couldn't get a divorce if he was pregnant. If I didn't love him, maybe I would love our baby. In a desperate attempt to stop him, I lied, telling him I'd had a vasectomy, that it was useless. He was silent for a long moment, then a low, soft laugh escaped him. He said that was fine. Then he would have my baby for me. My mind went blank. The drugs had taken full hold. He lifted me effortlessly, his omega strength surprising me, and carried me to the bed. His lips were searing as they found my neck. He whispered in my ear, asking how I would survive without him, how a man with a face like mine could navigate the world alone. He told me how beautiful I was when I cried. The words, so possessive and raw, were unlike anything I had ever heard from him. I told him to shut up, but he just continued, his voice a torrent of praise and desire, asking if he was doing a good job, asking if I liked it, making promises that made my body tremble. Later, after the storm had passed, I told him everything. The truth about where I came from, the script, the deal for my rebirth. The tears he had held back for so long finally fell. He said he would never believe me again, but the way he clung to me told me he already did. I threw him another birthday party, a real one this time. I let him wear the new suit he had bought for the first one, and I gave him the night he had dreamed of. His insecurity was a deep wound, and if letting him take control made him feel safe, then I would cede it gladly. Life was long. I was not a man for promises, but my actions would be my vow. He still asks me sometimes, his voice no longer pleading but filled with a happy, confident certainty. He asks if I love him, and I tell him that I do. He always smiles then, and tells me he loves me more.